Back during the Civil War, Allensworth, well, he was a free man now, but he'd been born in 1842 and held as a slave. He'd gotten away from that. And now he did what he could to fight for other men's freedom. And what he did to do that was to join the Union Navy. He worked as a sailor. See, the funny part was the Army at the start of the Civil War was segregated. They only wanted white soldiers. But African Americans could serve in the Navy. That was no problem at all. They'd been sailors ever since the American Revolution. And he was a pretty good one, and he served out the war. But then he thought, I want to continue my education. You see, his education was what had gotten him in trouble back when he was being held as a slave, because he had learned how to read and to write, and slaves weren't supposed to do that. They weren't allowed to learn how to read. They weren't allowed to learn how to write, and they were punished if somebody caught them at it. But he had learned, and he had been punished, and he wanted to keep learning. So it was that he went to school. In fact, he went all the way through what we would call a seminary to learn how to be a minister. And he became a minister, and he went on to preach. But years after the war, one of his old friends came to him and said, you know, for the African Americans still in the Army, we have a problem. They keep us in separate units, but they don't have African American ministers to serve as our chaplains. Do you think that's something you could do? Well, Reverend Allensworth thought to himself and said, I can try. And he wrote a letter to the President of the United States explaining why ministers should look like the men they were ministering to as chaplains, and why he should be a chaplain with one of the units in the U.S. Army. And eventually, the President of the United States thought, that's a good idea. And so Allen Allensworth became the chaplain for the 24th U.S. Infantry, which was a unit made up of dark-skinned soldiers and light-skinned officers, just like it had been during the Civil War. Well, the officers in that regiment weren't happy with the idea, but part of the letter that he'd written to the president said, I know that white officers might not accept me socially. I don't see a problem with that. Their job is to command men. Mine is to guard their souls. And so, as the chaplain of the regiment, he gradually became accepted by the men, if not always by the other officers. He spent 20 years as a chaplain in the U.S. Army, eventually rising to the rank of lieutenant colonel. By the time he retired from the Army, Lieutenant Colonel Reverend Allensworth was the highest ranking African American in the U.S. Army. Well, he retired, but that didn't mean he didn't have ideas of having something else to do. He was 64 years old when he came to Los Angeles, and he and his wife, well, after years as a minister, after years as a chaplain, after time spent in the Navy fighting for people's freedom, he wanted something else to do. And he looked around Southern California, and he thought, I have no idea what I can do to help people. Well, around that same time, a man named William Payne was in Pasadena. Now, he was also an African American, and he had come west because he thought California is a land that's free, that's growing, that's a beautiful place. There's got to be something there for me. You see, he was a school teacher, and he wanted to come west and be a school teacher in California. The only problem was that in California, no one seemed to want to hire an African American school teacher. The rules back then were different. Even in places where African Americans had no problem living, the school teachers were mainly white and female and unmarried. In fact, even in Pasadena, you could be fired from a school job if you got married. Well, William Payne thought to himself, there's got to be a way of doing this. And he started looking around, and he thought that one of the ways might be for there to be an African American community that could build itself up and fill its own jobs. And he ended up talking to the retired Lieutenant Colonel Allensworth. And they got to talking, and they got together with a few others, and they set up a business with the goal of buying some land and setting up a new town, the way Pasadena had been set up. You see, Pasadena was formed as what's called a colony. And a colony town is where a group of people buy land all together and divide it up among themselves or anybody they choose to let in the settlement. It's like buying a prefabricated house and assembling it. It's a prefabricated town. And so they looked for land. And at first they couldn't find any at a reasonable price in a reasonable location. But then they were approached by a land and water company. That company was up near Bakersfield, and they said, there's a perfect area of land up here. There's even a little train station at the center of it, but we haven't been able to develop it or do anything with it. We'll give you a good price on the land and on water rights that'll be able to provide for your community. Well, Allensworth and Payne thought that was a wonderful idea. And they looked at the land, and they looked at the contracts they were signing, and they set up the deal. They began recruiting African Americans to come up and join them. News went out all over the country that there would be a town in California by and for African Americans, north of Bakersfield in agricultural land, and that the goal was to set up a whole town there with more than just farming, eventually more industry and more other things. Well, because he was one of the founders and because everybody liked him, they named that town Allensworth. And at first, it was a really good deal. People bought land even if they weren't ready to move there yet because they wanted to invest in the idea. They didn't have a huge number of people come in, but soon they had lumber yards and churches, 3 churches, and a schoolhouse. Only things took turns for the worse. You see, a few years after this started, war broke out in Europe. Well, that messed up a lot of things, including the prices of goods. Then the land and water company that had sold them the land said, well, yeah, we made the deal to sell you the land and give you the water rights, but, it hasn't been raining a whole lot lately, and we have other customers for the water, and so we're going to deliver what we can, okay? Well, no, that's not okay. The contract said that the water was included in the deal, and the water was necessary for the agriculture, for growing things in a land that wasn't really heavy in rainfall. The area north of Bakersfield is dry. You can grow things there, but you need water. Then there was the fact that there were people agitating against the town. You see, one of the dreams of Allensworth and Payne was to build a big school there, one for college-age African American students, to learn the technology of agriculture, to learn other industries, mining and manufacturing, to have a school there to teach those things, just like a couple of the schools back east. There was nothing like that in California for dark-skinned students. Well, some of the folks, unfortunately, some white and some African American, said, "Now that's a terrible idea." And the white one said, "African Americans don't need education." And the African American one said, "We don't want separate education." Both sides argued against Allensworth as a location, and so money stopped coming in at as high a rate. People stopped moving there at as high a rate. And as the water dried up, the farms began failing. Well, Reverend Allensworth went back to talking to people in Los Angeles, all over the Los Angeles area. He spent time traveling back and forth, trying to convince people to support the town, to support the idea of the school they wanted to build. The railroad also turned against them. The Santa Fe Railroad owned the little station there and owned the tracks that ran through. And when Reverend Allensworth and William Payne and the others said, "Couldn't you hire people to help run that station?" Well, the Santa Fe said, "Sure, we'll hire somebody as a janitor to clean up the station." And when the others said, "Well, perhaps you could hire ticket agents or somebody to run the station out of our community," the Santa Fe Railroad folks said, "Nah, we've got white employees for that." And when the people in Allensworth protested, the Santa Fe built a spur line going to another nearby town so that goods could be dropped off for buying and selling there instead of in Allensworth. And that further hurt the community of Allensworth because it meant that farmers weren't bringing in their goods to ship out of the station there. In 1914, while things were stirring up in Europe, while the prices were volatile, while they were fighting with the water company and with the railroad, Reverend Allensworth was in Monrovia talking to people, trying to explain why they should support the community up there up north. And as he was leaving that talk, he was run over by two young men riding a newfangled thing called a motorcycle. Oh, they were young and they were energetic and they were just having a fun time riding that motorcycle. And they said that it was that old Reverend Allensworth's own fault. He must have stepped out right in front of the two on the motorcycle. They weren't charged for the accident that killed Reverend Allensworth. But the fact was that that motorcycle didn't just kill the Reverend. Over the course of the next couple of years, it killed the town. Because nobody else from Allensworth was as eloquent, as driven, and as well known to bring in the money and to bring in the new folks to Allensworth. And so over the next 14, 15 years, the town kind of dried up and blew away. By the time the final blow struck during the Great Depression, there was almost no one left in the town. The people who were there were farm workers who worked for nearby places and found out that there were empty houses they could live in for nothing because the owners had moved away. Those workers didn't do anything to maintain the houses. They just lived there as long as they could. And so the town of Allensworth gradually fell apart. Its memory was still there. In fact, there were people living in it to this day. A few hundred scattered around the whole area. Most of the residents there now are Latino farm workers and their families. But the town of Allensworth and the memory of Allensworth and the things that Reverend Allensworth and William Payne tried to build there, that memory is still alive. And there's a museum and a park there at the center of where the town was. A town that might still be there if the watermen had kept their deal, if the train company hadn't been so set in their ways, and if people had only believed in building the school. And that's the story of Allensworth.